to People Keeping It Sacred, our new program highlighting people keeping it sacred in the world. I'm Rabbi Helen Miller, founder of Keeping It Sacred, and I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Professor Helen Kim. Helen Kim is a professor of sociology and associate dean of academic affairs at Whitman College. She's co-author with Noah Levitt of JewAsian, Race, Religion, and Identity in America's Newest Jews, published by University of Nebraska Press. Helen is married to Noah and they have 2 children, and they all live in Walla Walla, Washington. I met Professor Kim back in 2009 when she was leading that research project on the Jewish and Asian relationships. And she came to my home and interviewed me and Melissa. And since then, I've followed her research and had the honor of accompanying her on her spiritual journey. I can't believe it's been 11 years since we first met. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great. It's great to be here and talk to you, Rabbi Miller.
I'm so glad to be here with you. I'd love to begin with your research on Jews of color. You've been at this for years now. And can you tell us a little bit about what led up to your book called JewAsian, which came out in 2016 after 7 years of careful and hard work, as well as how both the field of studying and community of Jews of color has been changing?
Sure. So I'm going to step back a little bit to 1997, which is when I met my now husband, Noah Levitt. We were graduate students at the University of Chicago. And, you know, we were falling in love. And in a time that was basically one generation after Loving v. Virginia, which was the Supreme Court case that overturned anti-miscegenation laws in the realm of marriage. And at the time, you know, I think physically around us, you know, we were starting to see in the streets and in the New York Times wedding section, not that that's a barometer of, you know, all of the US major demographic trends, kind of more attention being paid to couples crossing a variety of demographic lines, including racial lines, getting married. What was interesting to me at the time was in the American Jewish context, which for a long time had paid a lot of attention to intermarriage. And intermarriage at the time was largely conceived as a marriage between, so by marriage, I mean legal marriages and ones that at the time were taking place amongst heterosexual couples. So I say that to say, I think the usage of marriage in itself is potentially problematic. A lot of attention was being paid mostly to unions where the couple was 2 partners who were white, predominantly one being Jewish and the other being Christian. Mm-hmm. So I was really interested in whether or not there was any work being done to look at intermarriage, not only along religious dimensions and variations, but also along racial lines, racial and ethnic lines. And so I went and I kind of looked in the data to see whether or not places and institutions like Brandeis and the University of Connecticut, sort of these big institutions that were kind of demographic repositories for information on Jewish intermarriage, were doing anything or looking at any component of intermarriage in the Jewish community that had to do with racial variation. I even went to the URJ in New York to ask if the URJ was collecting any information on racial variations amongst congregants. And all those places basically said no. They were looking at intermarriage, but they were not looking at race per se. And I'll never forget this. actually Noah and I met with a kind of a higher up in the URJ, national office. And we talked about why it is that data on race generally was not being collected. Not just with regards to intermarriage, but with regards to how race plays out in the reform population. And he said in a kind of very serious and thoughtful way, he posited that the URJ was not collecting information on race because to do so would be to acknowledge the possibility of racism existing within the American Jewish community, and particularly the reform movement. So I thought that was just really striking when I heard that come out of his mouth. So in any case, all of these places were saying, no, we don't collect that data, we don't collect that data, but you should really go talk to Gary Tobin in San Francisco. Gary Tobin used to head the Cohen Center at Brandeis. And the short story is he sort of got sick and tired of academia and went and opened up his own think tank in San Francisco with his wife, Diane, that was focused on issues pertaining to contemporary Jewry, not just in the United States, but across the world. Gary and Diane are white and Ashkenazi. And they had divorced and had their own kids from previous marriages who were grown at the time. And Diane basically said to Gary, when Gary wanted to marry her, I'll marry you, but I want to raise a child with you. So in their 50s, they adopted a Black boy by the name of Jonah. And they set up an arm of their think tank called the Whole Shown in every tongue that was basically devoted to understanding the racial and the ethnic diversity of the Jewish population in the United States and worldwide. And it was a commitment to Jonah and a commitment that sprung from their desire as parents for him to never want to feel like he had to choose between his race and his religion. To kind of make a long story short, through a series of wonderful telephone calls and in-person meetings and cups of tea with Gary and Diane, they helped us sort of start our research project through their connections and their databases that they were keeping that did factor in racial variation within the American Jewish community. So it really, our work could not have ever come to fruition without Gary and Diane Tobin. So we started interviewing couples like you and Melissa way back when, and I don't know if you remember, Rabbi Miller, we spent, I don't know, probably somewhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours of time with you and doing those kinds of in-depth conversations where you press the play button and you record, and then you have to go and you have to transcribe all of the data. Takes a long time, and we ended up interviewing close to 40 couples along the West Coast and the East Coast. And that took a long time. And we had a kid somewhere along the way. Yes, it took a number of years. And then finally in 2016, we were able to publish JewAsian as a book.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so much dedication. You know, I think of the writing of the Shulchan Aruch supposedly took 22 years. And I think about, you know, this like long-standing commitment to a subject or to a text or to, you know, to a question. I love that you've had that long-standing connection to this question about about what does it mean, what do the relationships look like, and how do they function, and what can we learn from Jewish and Asian, relationships.
Yep. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about that interlap of the Venn diagram of where Jewish and Asian comes up specifically, because, right, I know that in your book you don't exclusively talk about Jewish and Asian, and even in this conversation you shared a little bit about being Jewish and Asian as well, and how that exists as well. Do you have any notes about people growing up as Jewish and Asian together, and what that experience is, or growing up in a household where there are parents who are Jewish and Asian as well?
Yeah, so for the kids, the adult children of the intermarriages who we interviewed, so they're JewAsian kids. So one parent is racially or ethnically Asian, who could also be Jewish.
Right.
And then the other parent is culturally or religiously Jewish, who could be Asian, but was mostly white. So those kids grew up with everything. There were some racially and ethnically Asian spouses who we interviewed, who either were born Jewish or had converted or were in the process of converting when we interviewed them. And I would say that the ways in which Jewish Asian, JewAsian kind of made sense or was talked about was along particular commonalities and dimensions where people saw a lot of alignment between and amongst aspects of what it meant to be Asian and aspects of what it meant to be Jewish. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion about value systems. So, Jews value education, Asians value education, Jews value this, Asians value the same thing. And while it was great and important for us to hear those things, I think one of the ways that Noah and I thought about what was going on was whether or not these supposed commonalities were another way of kind of reinventing what the model minority is. So, the typical tropes are hardworking, emphasis on family, emphasis on upward mobility, economically relatively well off, sometimes, with a overlaying of a rags to riches story. So we thought it was great that respondents found commonalities between the two as a way of making sense of what looked like differences on paper. But I think our ears kind of perked up in sort of the academic way to wonder, like, how much of this are you sort of instilling? How much are you kind of creating this narrative about what it means to be Jewish and Asian, to the extent where you're actually just kind of playing up stereotypes that we know have been applied to Jews and Asians for many, many, many decades, just in this new form. So that was those were interesting to kind of process and think about. And we wanted to make it clear that, yes, we were looking at one kind of racial and ethnic difference, one kind of racial, ethnic, and sometimes religious difference. But it's a very specific one, and Asians and Jews have very particular places in the American imagination. We did not interview couples where one partner is a white Ashkenazi Jewish woman and the other partner is a African American, comes from a Christian background woman. Mm-hmm. So this was certainly not the be all end all of what is actually lots of, I think, ongoing attention paid to the racial diversity within the American Jewish population that fortunately Noah and I are really happy to see is very different from what it was back in 2006.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to reflect a little bit on that because there has been such a great raising of awareness of Jewish people who identify as people of color as well. I mean, I think that I started hearing more about like a lifting up of communities after the the VP of Audacious Hospitality position was created at the URJ.
Yep.
And April Baskin was appointed into that position. And the idea that, you know, Jews of color are part of the fabric of the Jewish American experience, the Jewish experience especially, and that Reformed Jewish communities ought to take note and to, you know, to welcome in Jews of color as much as anyone else. And, you know, along with, there had been a lot of talk about intermarriage and children of intermarriages and people in interfaith relationships, and people should, you know, ought to welcome in those groups as well, because of all of the things that you had mentioned about, you know, the comments that we had experienced. But now I think there has been a greater awareness raised. Jews of color have existed forever, but I think there's been a greater awareness, particularly in the URJ, particularly because it is much more Ashkenazi normative and Ashkenazi, just generally speaking, centered, having come from the, you know, German immigration in the mid 1800s. So the idea that it would start having a consciousness around Jews of color, I think, was a huge, huge deal that I was very pleased with. But even since then, I think that the rabbis say, how are ears and doors alike? They say, how are ears and doors alike? What's similar about ears and doors? They say both can be opened and closed at will. Mm-hmm. And it's that finally the Jewish, you know, major Jewish institutions, the most major institution of the largest denomination in the United States, finally started opening its ears intentionally to Jews of color. So I wondered what your thoughts have been since that time, or even if you would mark it as earlier even than that. What kind of occasions should we be celebrating, and what still needs some work, and where do you see things right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, attention paid to Jews of color definitely predated the work that Noah and I did. Not only just in terms of the work of Gary Tobin, but also Katia Azulai. She's an anthropologist, I believe. She wrote a pretty formative anthropological book where she looked at Jews of color. There was scholarship, and I think attention paid to Jews of color before 2006 for certain. And I think that larger demographic trends in the United States, you know, we live in the American context, so we don't live separate from it. And I think what it is that the place that Jews of color have been able to have more recently, I think, is in part of the larger American context that we're in, as well as I think a lot of really important kind of institutional changes that have taken place. You mentioned April Baskin. I forget exactly the year when she was appointed to the VP of Audacious Hospitality role. But that was huge. um, particularly as a Jew of color, to occupy a major, sort of senior leadership role in the URJ. I mean, that's a huge structural change, which I think allowed for more attention to be paid, not just in reform circles, but I think April used her voice along with others, particularly in New York, to kind of elevate the voices of other Jews of color. And I remember her as being very involved in Black Lives Matter when Black Lives Matter first came on the scene. So as a Jew of color, to do that at that time, I think, that's sort of an example of how we have the convergence of the larger American context as well as the American Jewish context. Things were rolling.
Right.
I would say that it is not surprising to see the presence that Jews of color have. I think a lot of it is propelled by, as is the case with a lot of things, social media, the presence of social media. That's been a huge platform to raise awareness for so many things, including the voices of Jews of color. So I guess there's nothing that really surprises me at this point.
I think the social media part also is, that ability to coalesce groups too, right? Like, so if April is, appointed as the VP, and Yavila McCoy, who's been working on this for so long in the Midwest, and then, bringing people together online. I know Jewish Multiracial Network has been doing a lot of work too. And, all of these groups kind of coming together, coalescing into this awareness. One of the things that I think is really amazing is that it is Jews of color who are creating these moments and this movement. And it's not anymore like a white person saying we should value Jews of color. It's like Jews of color owning it, and white Jews being able to kind of more graciously step aside. I'm not saying it happens in every case, because it definitely doesn't, but the idea that Jews of color are doing it for themselves and claim space, and that is being affirmed and recognized in totally new ways. It gives me hope, raising a child who is Filipino and white, Jewish. It gives me a lot of hope for him and his generation, and also my white Jewish kid, that there can be that they can both have opportunities to flourish in their full Jewish selves. How has the past 11 years since the book was published, how has that shaped your own identity, your own sense of self?
So I grew up as somebody who had a lot of Jewish friends, was very comfortable in Jewish culture, knew a lot about Judaism as a religion, was living, in essence, a Jewish life, but was not Jewish, and never thought that I would convert because I didn't feel like I needed to. I felt pretty strongly about that. And then I had kids. I had kids. I had one kid in particular who admittedly did not see me as Jewish, because I wasn't on paper. I was in terms of my actions and the life that I led. But I wasn't in terms of my my quote lineage.
Formal status.
Yes, formal status, exactly. My other child, my daughter, totally thought that I was Jewish because of what I did, because of how I acted and how I behaved and how I lived. So that was interesting. And the child who didn't see me as fully Jewish really got to me. But it kind of came at a time when I really was grappling with this question of why I was so resistant to converting. And I was really resistant to converting after I'd been thinking about it for a while and always came up with, no, I'm not going to do it. Because I never really felt that I was seen in the larger American Jewish community. So I think with the publication of the book and the research and an evolving attention and presence of Jews of color, I really felt that at the time that I reached out to you to begin studying for conversion, I was only able to do that because I felt like I could see myself in the larger Jewish community. So I think that's a huge part of what the past 11 years has kind of given to me is sort of my own evolving sense of who it is I am as a person, and you know what it means for me to have taken the step to formally convert. I felt like I did it on my own terms, completely. Yeah, I felt like I acted out of self-agency. So that was it. I mean, that was a beautiful thing. And there's no going back. So I would say that's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of my own personal journey.
It was like an affirmation of the truth that already existed. It was like a formalization. As I saw it, it was really a formalization of your existence and what you had already been living, and to be able to, for you to have that ability to say to your child, like, I remember he was there.
Yes.
Here's the paper, like card carrying member, like, we're really just affirming what your mom really is, like.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't mean we didn't ask you questions still.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and I'll never forget this, Rabbi Miller. One of the things that you said to me, which I don't think I fully appreciated at the time. I mean, I understood it on an intellectual level. I don't think I got it on an emotional level because I hadn't experienced it yet. Was you said something to the effect of, Helen, with your conversion, you're going to have a very different amount of power in your relationships, your professional relationships, as somebody who, studies what she studies with the people that she studies with. You're going to have a different sense of power with your colleagues. And you're going to have a different sense of power in your relationship with other Jews who are not academics, namely my husband. It's totally true. Totally true. If I could just give one example, Noah, as he has become older, I would say is much more drawn to regularity, particularly of Shabbat and Havdalah, which he never grew up doing.
Mm-hmm.
Never. He gets a little agitated if we don't do those things at the right time. Even if we've come off of a plane at midnight and we're exhausted and we just want to go to bed, he wants to light the Havdalah candle and we just want to go to bed. He wants to do the ceremony. And that, as an example of the level of power, like I can say to him, I think it's okay for us to take a break. We're really tired. We're not going to be any less Jewish tomorrow. That's something I never felt that I could say.
And you can do Abdallah till Tuesday.
Yeah. There you go.
Researched it and was like, hey, now you know.
Yeah. But I think as an example of, the kinds of decisions that we make as a couple and as a family, there is a different level of power and legitimacy that I think that I do have now, which is nice. It's really important. It's really important. So, and I mean, I think that's to say we fully kind of, I think, as partners, are making those decisions, I think, in a fuller way.
Right. You're not just following his decisions and whatnot. You're an equal partner in that.
Yeah.
The only reason why I ever said that was because of my wife, who, converted to Judaism. And one of the reasons why she wanted to, there were a lot of reasons she wanted to, but one of the reasons that she had told me, which also stuck with me, is that she said that, when our kids are studying and, or like when we're sitting down to dinner for Shabbat, I want to be able to teach them just as much as you're teaching them. I want them to learn this from me as much as from you. I don't want to just rely on you to teach them or to do this piece of their identity formation. And that was a very, like you said, empowering kind of an approach. And that's also one of the reasons why when I founded Keeping It Sacred, I founded it on 3 principles, which is accessibility, relevance, and empowerment. Because I really do believe that when you engage with the text, you engage with ritual, and you engage with the tradition, the more you do so, the more empowered you are, the more able to more fully express your identity, your full identity, and to claim it with a perceived authenticity. You are already authentic, but there's a perception of authenticity that comes with the formalization of regular study and, actual physical conversion papers and, all of the things, these are reasons why people get married, right? Is because they've been in a relationship, and that's just fact that they're committed to each other. But once you break that glass, it's very clear that you're legitimate in a different way. And even if as it only affirms what we already knew, it still elevates that piece of identity that people are now a married couple. It just elevates it to a level that the community can more easily recognize, and that allows people the freedom to express themselves in that new identity. And I know that you're in a college town, so I imagine that the Jewish community changes a bit depending on the year and depending on the cycle of students who are there and depending on the professorships and the PhD students. So I wondered a little bit about, how you kind of ebb and flow with that.
Yeah, so we're a college of about 1,400 students, and I would say probably about 10% of the student population in any given year are Jewish students. And we have a Jewish student group on campus. And sometimes that student group is really, really active, and sometimes it's not. It kind of ebbs and flows. Students are here for 4 years. So that's their lifespan here. And sometimes they're active in terms of really participating with members of the larger Walla Jewish community, including doing things at or with the synagogue and its membership. And sometimes the mix of students is such where they're not so active. We also, because we work at the college, we have students over for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we have a sukkah at our house. So we invite that group over frequently, and that's a nice way to create community with that group of students who, they come in and out and they come in and out, but we do things on a consistent basis no matter what every year. So being with the Jewish students in the yearly cycle of Jewish life is just kind of a part of what we do. So I would say that's one way in which students interface with some members of the Jewish community in Walla.
That's beautiful. And wow, I didn't realize that 10% of the student body is Jewish. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
To Wellesley, and it was 7%. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And I think some Jewish students have grown up only being around Jews their whole life. And they come to Whitman, and it's the first time that they are not around Jews. And some students come predominantly having not had much exposure to other Jews. So it runs the gamut in terms of the students' lived experiences coming here.
It's great that you provide that community for them. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing of your brilliance. And I really it's such a pleasure to talk with you and to catch up a bit, and I'm so excited to be able to share your thoughts with a broader audience. Thank you to our audience for tuning in as well. If you have someone that you'd like to recommend that we host on the show, please contact us at rabbiheathermiller.com. There you can also sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date with all that we're programming, opportunities to study together, and more. Thanks everyone for keeping it sacred. Be well.